Hello and welcome along. Yes, I'm finally back with a new video. So this time we're going to talk about the Nemean. Now, he is a mysterious character from the Horus Heresy period who would go on to become one of the first Grandmasters of the Grey Knights. Now, how did he become that? How did he get there? Who was he in the beginning? Now, he is a very interesting character because he's quite mysterious. He doesn't seem to have come through the normal route to being a knights errant as the other 19 did. This is because he was already essentially a renegade when he was recruited. He wasn't a loyalist who had been sort of isolated from his legion or had done something that meant it was difficult for him to serve with his legion like most of the other knights errants, or a loyalist from a traitor legion, so found it impossible obviously to continue with his legion because his legion had suddenly turned on everything he thought was their ideals, like Nathaniel Garro or others. And so he had left his legion already and was essentially a pirate, a warlord, a corsair who was building his own empire in the region of the galaxy known as the Pale Stars, which is an area which is very rich in resources but also full of aliens and pirates, and is very difficult for the Imperium to control, and it's quite like a borderland area where prone to rebellions and very hard for the Imperium to maintain control over. And of course, during the Heresy, when their resources were stretched beyond their capabilities, it was nearly impossible to keep any sort of control over this region. And he decided, for some reason, to go into this area and start staking his own claim. Now, he had a group of followers who grew up around him. He seems to have attracted to him. It's hard to tell how many of them were actually Astartes, but it seems like most of them were unenhanced humans of various types. And they called themselves the Dark Brotherhood. I mean, a pretty foreboding name already. So he's not exactly the classic good guy hero of the Imperium. Now, he seemed to have picked up this name, the Nemean, at some point during his life. It's hard to tell if he got that during his time as a pirate, corsair, building his own empire, or it was something he took with him from his previous life as a loyal Astarte when he was serving in a legion. It seems like it may have been something that he already had, this name, and it comes from Greek mythology, which is the Nemean lion, which was a lion that had essentially impenetrable fur that couldn't be harmed by normal human weapons. And it seems that his armor was considered so good that it was like the Nemean lion's fur. It couldn't be penetrated, or it realistically couldn't be penetrated. A very effective suit of extremely well-crafted artificer armor that he wore, and he therefore picked up this name because of how hard it was to hurt him. Well, at the same time, he was also supposed to have incredibly bad wounds, scarring, that showed he'd been in some terrible incident during some major campaign somewhere. At least that's the idea. And it's believed that that was the third Rangdan Xenocides. So that's slightly contradictory. Obviously, he's got this incredible armor that can't be penetrated, but also he's terribly scarred from some horrible attack by some alien during the Rangdan Xenocides. But there you go. So two things can be true at the same time. Perhaps his armor is incredibly good, but this attack was just so tremendously powerful that it managed to wound him, and that's just the way things were. Exactly where the origin of this idea that he fought in the Rangdan Xenocides come from is not exactly clear, because just because he's terrible scarring does not mean he fought in a particular campaign. I mean, he could have got that absolutely anywhere. He could have got that from his own legion, for all we know. So wherever he got these scars from, wherever he got this incredible armor from, there is this general idea that he is a previous member of the Dark Angels, probably an officer, a relatively high-ranking officer, so let's say a captain, who fought in the Rangdan Xenocides, was generally very impressive, built up an incredible reputation amongst the legions, not just within his own legion, but wider amongst the Imperium, picked up this tag, the Nimeon, because of how great his armor was and how powerful and effective he was in fighting. But some tragic event occurred which caused him this terrible injuries, and he was left for dead and recovered, and later sort of decided to abandon the Imperium, or some other events happened and he decided that he was going to leave the Imperium and strike out on his own. And this has all happened before the Heresy, and then during the Heresy he decides, well, this is an area of space that I can be relatively safe from what's going on in the rest of the Imperium, the war between Horus and the Emperor, and I can build my own little empire which will keep me safe. Survival seems to have been his main motivation, and Perhaps that's part of the trauma from his terrible wounds, that he just wants to be somewhere where he can be in control and be safe, and that's his whole goal. It may also be the fact that this area of space is incredibly rich in natural resources, and he has a thing for wealth. Maybe he's trying to build up his own enormous wealth. That would be unusual for Astartes, but it could be that. Maybe he has had some great revelation during his time as an Astarte and realised that, well, what am I doing this all for? I want to do something for myself, not be completely in service to some far off demigod that I've never even met and have nothing in common with. Who knows? Was he almost sort of an archetypal traitor, one who just wasn't tempted by chaos, didn't go down the course of following chaos and just became a renegade, like many of the Space Marines Astartes would do throughout the history of the Imperium? They would become renegades who just went and did things for their own self-interest, because they realized they were incredibly powerful beings who, should they actually choose to do things for themselves, could have almost anything, because they could defeat almost any enemy. They could build empires. They could command men. They could take over whole planets, systems, command fleets, etc., all for themselves instead of somebody else for the Imperium. Of course, there's deep in the DNA of the Astartes is some kind of built-in loyalty. Sort of, they have this very strong sense of loyalty, but obviously that has been overcome many times by Astartes, and they have turned traitor, not just to follow the forces of chaos, where you can argue, well, they were corrupted and they were misled or something. They have also left just to simply do things for themselves, strike out on their own and serve their own self-interest. This happens a lot throughout the Imperium's history. So perhaps he was simply one of the earlier individuals to have this moment of clarity of like, well, why am I doing all these things for other people? Why am I putting my life on the line for them all the time, almost dying? Maybe I should do that for myself. Imagine what I could achieve for myself. Maybe that's what he did. So you've got him setting himself up in the Pale Stars as his own little Imperium, his own little kingdom, when the Alpha Legion start to pay attention to this area of space, because they want to disrupt it. They want to cause all sorts of chaotic events to try and destabilize the area so that the region can be claimed for Horus and that the Imperial forces could be weakened. So, as we said, the control over this area is very weak anyway, and it largely falls to the individual Imperial governors of the planets in the area. And so the Alpha Legion, with a relatively small force, are able to destabilize this area much more by simply turning up and saying, you should join Horus because of, he'll be good to you, basically. He'll give you the things that you have been denied. He'll make you more powerful, make you richer. And this generally sways them. And also a little bit of but if you don't, you know what's going to happen kind of thing. So carrot and stick. The Imperial governors are kind of like, well, yes, we probably should, because there's no Imperial forces around other than us. And the Alpha Legion are pretty scary. And the threat of Horus's whole fleet turning up in the region, obviously they know that they couldn't resist that. So that was a little bit of encouragement of like, well, actually, you'll get all the good things if you go along with us. You'll be more powerful. You'll get the great benefit of being one of those governors that showed your loyalty to Horus early. And you weren't forced into it. You chose to follow Horus, so you'll be getting all of the good stuff. Well, the people that you don't like, they'll be punished. They'll be, so we can take all their stuff and give it to you. I mean, this is of course something that every conqueror does whenever they move into a new area. They always, if you're loyal to me, I'll give you all the stuff of the people that aren't going to be loyal to me. And usually there's lots of petty rivalries and so on in every area where you can quite easily exploit one group against another. And that's exactly what the Alpha Legion did. And that's, of course, what they're great at doing. However, the Alpha Legion had this additional problem in this area, which was this Nemean and his Dark Brotherhood. So the Dark Brotherhood had become relatively powerful. They were quite well known in the area. They were feared, and they couldn't just be ignored. And so the Alpha Legion basically made it their main task was to try and defeat this Dark Brotherhood, get rid of them, because they were a barrier for them to take over the region for Horus. And so while the rest of the heresy is going on out there in the rest of the galaxy, in the Pale Stars, you've got this relatively small force of Alpha Legion trying to defeat this relatively small petty kingdom of the Dark Brotherhood. And they fight for a very long time, several years, where they battle each other quite equally. They use a lot of the tactics that the Alpha Legion are famous for: a lot of misdirection, a lot of sacrificing others, a lot of collateral damage ensues amongst the Imperial worlds, and neither side particularly care about that. So the Nemean is not some noble hero. He isn't there to protect the Imperial citizens. He doesn't really care about them at all. He's there for his own benefit, and he wants to defeat the Alpha Legion because they're a threat to his power. And the Alpha Legion want to defeat him because he's a threat to their power. And that's it. It's a game between them in some sense. It's a trap within a trap within a trap. They're very complex tactics that both sides use to try and outwit the other side and defeat them eventually. But usually it just involves lots of civilians getting killed and the various planetary governors not knowing what the hell they should do or which side they should be on, but ultimately feeling that they have to stick with the Alpha Legion because they seem to be a slightly better option than siding with the Dark Brotherhood and the Nimeon. So eventually this whole situation comes to a head when Nathaniel Garro turns up because Malcador has heard about the Nimeon and wants to recruit him, and so sends Garro to go and get him. He doesn't send anyone to go and save this part of Imperial space from falling to the Alpha Legion and virtually Horus. He sends them to take away this guy that's probably the one barrier to the Alpha Legion actually taking control of that area of space. And eventually, after some internal squabbles amongst the Dark Brotherhood, the Nemean leaves with Garro. What happens to them after that? Nobody knows. Probably they will die. Obviously, eventually, that area of space is returned to Imperial control, but I imagine a lot of people died in the interim period, with the Dark Brotherhood sort of scrambling to fighting amongst itself, the Alpha Legion taking advantage of that weakness and destroying them. But Malcador got what he wanted. He got this guy, this incredible warrior who's a great commander. Obviously, it's someone who went toe-to-toe with the Alpha Legion in terms of tactical wit, complexity. He was obviously a very skilled commander, someone who was known as a great individual fighter as well. So this is a great person to have on your side. Is he worth abandoning an entire region of Imperial space? Probably not. But anyway, he eventually turned out to be so great that he was chosen to be one of the founding fathers of the Grey Knights, to be one of the first Grand Masters, where he's believed to become known as Epimetheus. A lot of the stuff around the Nemean and a lot of stuff around Malcador's Knights Errants and a lot of stuff about the founding of the Grey Knights is very vague and hard to pin down. So, all of the individual bits that led us to this point could be completely wrong. But this seems to be the main thread of the story, the main accepted view, that he is this ex-Dark Angel who fought in the Rangdan genocides, got terribly wounded, left the Legion, or was left by the Legion, became essentially a pirate, tried to build his own empire, got recruited by Garro, became one of the Knights Errants, decided that he was, after all, very loyal to the Emperor, so loyal, in fact, that he could be selected to become a Grand Master of the Grey Knights, and he takes on this new identity as Epimetheus and goes on into history as that. Now, I feel like that's probably as true as we're going to likely to get to extract from the various conflicting lore of the 40k universe, particularly in the Horus Heresy period, where there's so much mixture of legend and truth that it's hard to pick out exactly what happened. Now, let's say that this is what happened. That brings up a few interesting questions, I think. So, first of all, why did he suddenly become so pro-Emperor after he clearly had abandoned his belief in the Emperor? He had left his legion, or he'd been left by his legion. He'd gone off on his own. He'd founded his own petty kingdom. He was part of the problem as far as other Imperial people would see. He's a renegade Astarte, something that at this time would have been incredibly rare. These are pre-heresy. It would be like, what? How is this possible? An Astarte that doesn't serve the Imperium, that is out there doing his own thing for himself. That is almost unthinkable. And to then switch over to being so loyal that he could become a knight errant of Malcador, and then so loyal amongst those knight errants that he could be selected to be one of the Grand Masters of the Grey Knights, a force that was created to be the counter to the threat of chaos because of how incredibly loyal they were. That is quite a turnaround, isn't it? So there's no doubt he was obviously this great, incredible individual fighter, that he built up this reputation, and that would probably pique the interest of someone like Malcador. Like this, oh, there's this guy, he's not actually in a legion as well, so he's up for grabs. I can take him, be one of mine. That would make sense that he would be picked out. Like he would make a good candidate in that sense. But he's obviously got very suspicious loyalties. So what made Malcador think that he would be worth risking taking into the Knights Errant? It turned out to be a good risk because he did get a chance to prove himself as a Knight Errant, so much so that he was selected to become a Grand Master of the Grey Knights. So he obviously was not a lost cause. He was someone that had this within him somewhere, that he could be drawn out of him and he could show his true worth and go on to serve the Imperium again. And the fact that Malcador was willing to take him from the Dark Brotherhood at this time of crisis when they're fighting the Alpha Legion for control over this important region of space means that he was willing to sacrifice that as well just to get this guy on board, to get him to be one of his Knights Errant, which obviously implies that Malcador was very deeply invested in getting hold of him and that he was very important. And I suppose you could argue that that's because all of the Knights Errant, that all 20 of them, were key individuals that would do things at some point in their future lives that would be critical to the success of the Imperium, or at least stopping the complete failure of the Imperium with a Chaos victory. And that's why they were selected. So it's more than just how good they are at fighting or maybe what their psychic potential was and so on. These are just kind of useful additions. Really, it's about some foreseen task or action they would take that would be critical to the survival of the Imperium, and that's why they're being selected. And then, therefore, any price that is paid for that is worth it. So you can just give up an entire region of space because if you don't get this one critical piece on your board, you're going to lose. So you have to get it, whatever the stakes are. And that seems to be why Malcador picks him, not because of any of these other things about him, or how great he was, or any way like this. He had this other member of the Knights Errant called Severian, who was an ex-Lunar Wolf, who seems to have been, was a powerful latent psyker. Didn't know he was a psyker. He didn't have active powers. His powers basically made him able to be invisible in some sense, so to be not perceived by others. So he could walk around much like certain members of the Raven Guard could, and he could just blend into the background. And he also seems to have had an ability to pick out these other potential Knight Errants for Malcador, and he was sent on a mission to basically identify them. He didn't recruit them as such. He just went and said, "Yeah, this is someone we should have. Need to have this guy and this guy." And he came up with this list of 20. And so he seems to have some ability to detect someone else's future impact on Malcador's plans, and that's why each person was selected. And which really means that almost none of the little things that are going on, all the battles, the various, even quite big wars, are really that important to Malcador or to the fate of the Imperium. It's really more about these very specific moments in time where a few individuals do very specific things that lead to his plan, or his plan, really the Emperor's plans, coming to fruition, and lead to Chaos not being fully successful in their coup, using Horus, of course, which gives you kind of a different perspective on the heresy and really all of the events of the heresy when you think about how little meaning most of these absolutely titanic battles have. And really it's all about these few individuals doing these very specific things at the right time in the right place. Now, of course, also, this brings up the fact that while not all of the Knight Errants were psychers, many of them were latent psychers. Some are active psychers, not many. Several turned out to be psychers. They were latent psychers whose psychic abilities emerged later on during the heresy. And one of them being Severian. Well, another, therefore, would be the Nemean, because there's no sign that he was a Psyker during this time fighting the Alpha Legion, or previous to this. He wasn't known as a great librarian or anything like this. He was a warrior, a captain, certainly an officer, not a Psyker. So he seems to have developed psychic abilities while a knight errant, like some of the others did. And perhaps that was part of the reason he was picked out by Severian, who could detect this latent ability within him, because he would have to have been a Psyker by the time he became Grand Master of the Grey Knights, because they all were. And not just any Psykers, they were all powerful Psykers by this point. So some of those had been powerful librarians in their previous lives for their legions. Most of them had not been active Psykers. And so to go from a person with some latent psychic ability in the background to a full-blown powerful Psyker who's so powerful he could be put into a position of leadership in a legion of Psykers like the Grey Knights is another quite a big turnaround for the Nemean. So he's a guy that had a huge amount of character development going on during his life. Now, the last thing I'd like to say about the Nemean is, was he really a Dark Angel? Because there seems to be a lot of assumption here. The only thing I can find that connects him to being a Dark Angel, well, there's two things actually. One is the fact that he's believed to have been injured during the Rangdan genocides. Well, that's quite a stretch, because the only reason he's believed to have been injured during the Rangdan genocides is because of these hideous wounds he has. He could have picked them up anywhere, as we've said. I mean, that does not imply he was in the Rangdan genocides. And even if he was, there were multiple legions fighting in that conflict, not just the Dark Angels. Although they were the most prominent, there were many others. So he could have been from any legion, really. There's no reason to connect him that way. The other one, and perhaps a slightly stronger link, is the fact that his name is the Nemean. As we said, the Nemean lion is where that comes from, and the lion is the lion, the Primarch of the Dark Angels. So perhaps that's the closest link to him, but that is, again, a very weak link. It's really much a stretch to say, oh, look, he's got lion in his name, he must be a Dark Angel. Okay, also, it just occurred to me, well, the Dark Brotherhood, obviously, are the group he commands. That's a link to Brotherhood. I mean, how many organizations in the 40k universe have dark in their name? That doesn't make them Dark Angels, does it? So, well, perhaps he was another legion. Perhaps he was a member of a different legion. I mean, if he did fight in the Rangdan genocides, perhaps he was a member of one of the Lost Legions. Perhaps. Could have been. But actually makes him quite a bit more of an interesting character if he was. That also might explain why he became a renegade before anyone was a renegade. Perhaps he was a renegade because his legion had been wiped out or secretly absorbed into the Ultramarines. Perhaps that was his way of his protest against the Imperium. Perhaps later he realised, well, that actually had to be done, and he kind of gave up the blame he'd put on the Imperium for doing that, for purging his legion, and that's why he decided to join Malcador and fight for the Emperor again. Perhaps he was even given some secret knowledge about what his Primarch had done, which caused the Primarch to be purged and his legion to have to be removed from history. Perhaps that swung him over to the side of the Loyalists. Now, that would make for a great story, I think. I'm not saying this is true. Obviously, I've just made this up. But it would be a good background for him. And it's one that is perfectly plausible, just as plausible as him being a Dark Angel, in my opinion. He could be a member of the Alpha Legion. Someone who disagreed with the path that the Alpha Legion were taking. We know that the Alpha Legion, during the Heresy, fought each other quite a lot for unknown reasons. Sometimes they didn't even seem to know why they were fighting each other. There's obviously this idea that Alfarius had a plan and that Omegan decided he disagreed with it at some point and started fighting against him. And certainly there was some internal conflict. Some Alpha Legion did remain loyalists. Some were traitors, and some of the ones that thought they were loyalists were actually traitors, and vice versa. It's a whole mess, obviously. But that was intentional, of course. But perhaps he's one that decided, I don't really know which side I'm on. I'm just going to go and set out on my own. I'm going to set out on my own, build my own little empire as a renegade. And then he got persuaded by Garro to join Malcador and become a knight errant. And he realized, yeah, actually, this is what really serves humanity best. And I'll go and become a Grand Master of the Grey Knights. It's possible. That would also make quite a good story, especially if he still isn't entirely sure of where his loyalties lie, and he's trying to play both sides, and he has done all the way through the history of the Grey Knights. That would be pretty good. So they're two great stories, better than him being a Dark Angel, frankly. So yeah, let me know what you think. Do you think the Nemean was a Dark Angel? Do you think he really got wounded in the Rangdan genocides? Why do you think he became one of the earliest renegades? What was he really doing in the Pale Stars, building his own petty little empire? What made him flip back to the Imperium? So much so that he became one of its most loyal servants again. So as always, great to hear your ideas in the comments. I'm sure you have some interesting ideas of who he really was. And if you haven't yet, please like, subscribe and share. That really helps the channel. And I will see you next time.